welcome to Island Connections. I am Brahim Aoude, host of this evening's show. Tonight's topic is Afghanistan, Patriot Acts, and we have three guests to discuss the issues that we have for you tonight. On my left is S. Charushila. Thank you for coming. And she's Assistant Professor of Women's Studies at UH Manoa. And then Faride Farhi, thank you for coming. She's associated with the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. And also we have Sankaran Krishna, thanks for coming again, and Department Chair of Political Science at UH Manoa. So we have a number of things to talk about today, but we would like to start with an interview I did with Jim Dater, and it's recorded earlier, so we can watch this one.
At least the American public have not been told, and if anything the American public ought to know is not to trust their government. I mean, we have just example after example after example of excuses and explanations that turn out to be lies. And in this instance, I just think that the Americans are so shocked, so profoundly demoralized by the event that the government, in a sense, had to do something. And they took a convenient and perhaps actually guilty set of people and have gone after them. But I think that the reason they chose that particular group probably has to do with American interests, or some Americans' perceived interests, that go well beyond the actual provocation of the bombing. And I think that interest is oil, that there is oil to the north of Afghanistan, and there are nice ports to the south of Afghanistan, and if we can somehow get the oil across Afghanistan into our SUVs, then any amount of bombing is justifiable in that case. And I think ultimately that might be the real reason in back of the attack there, and the fact that there is has been this increasing drumroll of hate against Islamic interest of any sort, and so that the word fanatic and Islam has been linked in the American mind, that we are quite willing to assume that they are in back of the 9/11 events, and to permit and encourage and celebrate the bombing events.
So it's oil and Islam. So do these two things mix together? Or Faride, for instance, what do you think?
Well, certainly they are important elements of the area. There is no doubt that there is oil in the Central Asia and Caucasus, and even before the bombing, during the Taliban era, there were serious talks about bringing oil down using the Afghan route as opposed to, for example, the Iranian route, which the United States deems as unacceptable because the regime in Iran is not a regime the United States feels it can deal with. As far as the connection to Islam, however, I think it becomes a little bit more complicated than just a mere direct connection. The reality is that Afghanistan was a failed state, and in many ways it was impossible to conduct business in Afghanistan, because even if United States could get its connections to Afghanistan, there was never guarantee that Afghanistan would remain stable. Whether or not United States will be able to pursue its interests in Central Asia and Caucasus is something to be seen, however. There is no doubt that the United States has interest, but I think the politics of the area are just a lot more complicated than the direct connection. At this point, I think there are a lot of other variables that need to be taken into account.
Yeah. So, Charushila, for instance, what are some of the other variables in your opinion?
I think that if there is stability, there is no doubt that economic interests will be followed through. Whenever there is stability, economic interests are put forward. But I think that rather than a kind of immediate rational calculation of, okay, we go in, this is how much we could get from oil, and so on, a much more important concern at this moment is ensuring stability in the region in general. And I think there is both a serious miscalculation of whether you can secure stability simply by propping short-term appropriate coalitions, or whether alternate kinds of much more serious changes or shifts in how US and the UN and allies approach regional stability. And so that's particularly around democratization, human rights. So I think that's an ongoing concern.
Yeah, also there is this whole larger geopolitical concerns regarding the United States, and you have alluded to it. But, for instance, India and Pakistan, Kashmir, for instance. And if we want to factor in Russia now, some people think maybe it's not the U.S. that has, quote-unquote, won, if that was a victory over the Taliban. But perhaps the Russians. So do you see any kind of connection in terms of the larger region between the Russians and all these other interests?
Well, there are actually a number of connections with the larger region. And in that respect, I think some Americans might be surprised about certain things that are going on. For instance, contrary to previous instances of U.S. aggression in various parts of the world, this time around, there is a lot of support for what the U.S. is doing as far as the Taliban is concerned in some very unlikely places. As far as India is concerned, ever since the 99 war against Pakistan and Kargil and Kashmir, Indians are convinced that almost all the problems in Kashmir can be traced to groups like, the Taliban and Mujahideen, who are seen as mercenary groups which are hyper-educated just in Islam and nothing else, and are going around to various places fomenting unrest and revolution. So as far as India is concerned, there's a real sense amongst the Indian media and the middle-class public that America is taking care of some of our dirty work for us by cleaning up the Taliban. This is also true to some degree for China, whose southern provinces do have a fairly sizable Islamic minority, which has been sort of viewed as a potential danger in the long run. So there are these wider connections, absolutely, but one of the important things is that the wider connections are a little more complex. Whereas, U.S. aggression in Iraq 10 years ago was unilaterally condemned in India, and in fact, the Indian Prime Minister went and, in a much publicized faux pas, gave Saddam Hussein a bear hug in the months leading up to the Gulf War, which got him a lot of unpopularity in the world media. But that's one indication of how this time around the picture is a little more complex.
Yeah. But that doesn't suggest, though, that wipe out the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda network, then Kashmir's problems will be solved. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to make that.
View,
yeah.
No, and I think, in fact, it makes it doubly more important in terms of the kind of dynamics that exist in the area. For instance, Iran is another country that is an ally of United States in this war against Taliban. So that's another unusual situation. However, what everybody is fearful of is that this military action that so far looks rather destructive, not only destructive of Taliban and Al-Qaeda network, but also the landscape and people of Afghanistan, that if it's not followed up by constructive action of creating something that at least was better than before, not necessarily greatly better, but at least a little bit better, then the implications are even worse than before, that you still have a failed state, you still have infighting in Afghanistan, and then you have all this anger towards the destructive power that has been unleashed by United States in the region. So it's very important to think in terms of the implications and consequences of what is happening.
On a less macro level, perhaps micro, regarding not the region but just Afghanistan, some people celebrate this victory, if we can say that it is a victory already, of the United States and Afghanistan, that women of Afghanistan have been liberated or are on the way to being liberated, etc. So before I ask you, Charu, to comment on this, we would like to watch a tape. And the tape is ready regarding that issue.
If anybody wants seriously to have a democratic government in Afghanistan, the surest way to reach that is by involving women. And I must say, the last few weeks, this was acknowledged at many levels. UN speakers mentioned that. I heard officials in at the highest level in the United States making a case of that. I know that many Congress women are mentioning that and working very hard, for instance, for RAVA, members of RAVA, the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, to be involved. Now, that is the talk, right? That is what is being discussed outside Afghanistan. The beauty, I think, right now is that within Afghanistan, women are already trying as much as they can to become partners in the public area. I know for a fact that RAVA members are now speaking up in public. I know that the first girls were able to enroll at the university. Last week we heard of 2 young girls who were able to register at the medical school. I think those are very important steps. Education is not anymore underground education for girls. It's now all out in the public space. Now, some people may be a little bit skeptic because the pictures that we see of Afghanistan shows us still women that who wear the burqa, right, who are entirely veiled. So what does that mean? Does it mean that we have a majority of women that does not want to be involved? Does it mean that they are still scared? We don't know exactly what is going on. But I think the fact that we do have a good contingent of women there in the public space might prepare the basis for women then also becoming part of the new government. And again, without women participation, there won't be democracy in Afghanistan.
So, Charu, are you skeptical about women's role in the new Afghanistan, in quotes?
Yes. I'm not skeptical of Tamara's claim that a serious democratic solution that doesn't involve women is not going to happen. There, I think she's absolutely right. And I think she's also right that if you look at Afghani women today, and even in the refugee camps earlier, Afghani women have shown enormous amount of agency and of efforts, either through underground efforts to continue schooling of daughters and sisters, or through current efforts in the media to present their case. What I'm skeptical about is whether we are currently seeing any serious effort in the accords beyond the occasional speech or the occasional acknowledgement, as Tamara put it, to both incorporate women into the process all the way through. And second, whether serious attention is being paid to the absolute necessity of reconstruction, as Farideh put it, which is that you have women able, willing, ready to participate, but in a situation where the institutions are destroyed, where jobs are scarce, where the infrastructure doesn't work, you would need to be able to create enough opportunities, enough reconstruction, and so that people can lead not fabulous lives, but, you know, reasonably stable, secure lives which are not fearful that repression might return, lives where there is some kind of hope that there is a long-term process. And I think that is not absent. There's this assumption that you include women. That just means that women somehow show up and say something, and then that's the end of that. So I'm skeptical at that level. Yeah.
The other thing is that they say that the new government will have 2 women. It's an interim government anyway, but you'll have 2 women there. But what kind of women? Are they women from Rawa who were like really fighting the Taliban in secret and all this stuff? Some of them have been executed, well executed under the Taliban, etc. So why don't we have Rawa women in Afghanistan, for instance?
I was not invited to bond,
Yes.
so...
I wonder why.
Yes, it's a revolutionary organization, and I'm not sure if they themselves are quite up to the process of negotiation that involves, staking a claim into this provisional government. The two women who are part of the provisional government, one is in charge of sort of predictably women's affairs, and the other one is an eminent doctor in charge of health matters. I think it's an important statement. It cannot be ignored. However, as Shahrukh pointed out, the fundamental realities of Afghanistan is that, first of all, this is a provisional government that itself is faced with all sorts of questions about viability. It was an agreement that was not made in Bonn, and it's not exactly clear if the forces in Afghanistan will follow the agreements on the ground. And it can, I think, be successful if it has tremendous support from the international community, and questions that are related to the deep humanitarian crisis that is facing Afghanistan are dealt with. It is only then that you can actually begin a real discussion about how everybody can play in this dynamic.
Yeah, and also there are other matters, for instance, regarding reconstruction, for instance. Are we, for instance, victorious in Afghanistan to the point that we can begin reconstruction right now as Afghanis, for instance? Or the international community would be able to help out as of now in terms of reconstruction? Have we totally won militarily over everybody there that needs to be won over? Krishna?
Well, I think notions of a complete military victory is a discourse or a rhetoric from previous eras and previous wars. Very, very few states have been able to deal successfully with these sorts of movements. I'm referring specifically to guerrilla movements, which are totally decentralized, which don't, stake out territory and try to retain it. And so claims about a complete US military victory, I think, are really, anachronistic. I mean, I can give an analogous example. When India was in Sri Lanka, they committed so much military power, so much material, everything, and occupying land turned out to be the most disastrous thing they could do. So I'm not sure, if the idea is to break up some of these terrorist networks or hideouts, that's going to be temporary, because the social basis of those movements resurface. And with that, the networks re-emerge. So even this notion that somehow, this is typically American, the idea that once you get bin Laden or something like that, the problem is going to disappear, it's just, it's completely naive, quite frankly.
But the Indians, when they were in Sri Lanka, they didn't have daisy bombs, so you gotta put all your bets on the daisy bomb to do the
That's true,
work,
but
right?
The United States tried the cutting edge of technology in Vietnam for as long as they did.
Exactly, yeah. So it's not that. The other thing is, to me, that is disturbing. The Americans are already talking. In fact, they have been operating behind the scenes to get rid of Al-Qaeda networks and other terrorist organizations worldwide. And they have said that much, in fact. Yes. So they're talking about, for instance, going to the Philippines and other places. So we have an interview with Dean Aligado, and he's talking about the Philippines and this kind of issue regarding terrorism. So the tape is ready, we roll.
The founder of the Abu Sayyaf so-called terrorist group, Andang, in the 1970s, he was just 10 years old. And when the Marcos regime bombed Hulot, where he comes from, he saw his family pretty much wipe out, including his grandmother, whose head was cut. And this innocent kid became radicalized because of that. And I guess the point I'm trying to make, similar to the sowing the dragon's teeth analogy, is he came back and was recruited by the Moro National Liberation Front and eventually found his way going to Pakistan, became a mujahideen, and came back to the Philippines to start the Abu Sayyaf. So in many instances, the Moro National Liberation Front or the Moro Islamic Liberation Front have very legitimate grievances that has to be addressed. The Mindanao is the site of some of the poorest provinces in the country that have been neglected, and resort to rebellion is one manifestation of their effort to make their life better. And that is also going on in other parts of Southeast Asia. So now that the U.S. is trying to build a global coalition, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand are again back on its radar screen, and the U.S. is providing, in the case of the Philippines, over $400 million in military aid to combat terrorism. And again, it's going to be used against the people of Mindanao. Some of these states were formed by colonial powers and were just forced to become part of either the Philippines or Indonesia. So they go beyond the current fight against so-called terrorism. And as I said earlier, the only way to resolve this, because these are struggle for social justice, economic justice, and fights of people who are different culturally, but by religion maybe are of the Muslim faith, but it doesn't mean they're part of this Islamic conspiracy to bring down the United States. But it's become a convenient way for the U.S. to reinsert itself into the affairs of a lot of these countries in the region.
Yeah, before we discuss this, I'd like to remind our viewers that we're live on the air, and we'd love to hear your comments, questions, what have you. And you can call us at 956-5670 for Oahu and neighbor islands, 1-800-342-7949. And the numbers are on the screen, so please call us, make comments, what have you. Okay, so we're going to the Philippines.
I think we have gone to the
Yes,
Philippines.
$400 million already.
Not only that, but
Yes.
there are American agents in,
Yes.
about 200 of them already in the Philippines. I think this points out to a very important source of tension and brings out an important question that I think is a source of tension between the Americans and the Europeans. And it has to do with how to go about fighting quote-unquote terrorism, whether you go wide or you go deep. And I think the center of the conflict at this point is in Afghanistan. Essentially, the Europeans arguing that if you want to root out terrorism, you have to make commitments that are, as I tried to suggest before, suggest a constructive alternative to the kind of terrorist activities that people have engaged in. And Afghanistan is a good place to show that alternative. Now, if you start spreading your net very wide, going after so-called terrorists everywhere, and essentially using a military option without doing anything constructive, what you essentially do is you insert yourself in domestic politics of various different countries, and of course you exacerbate the social and economic inequalities that are already there. You already see that tension in Afghanistan too, where even you have differences between the British and Americans. The British want to bring in the peace forces, and the Americans are saying, no, this is still a military operation, and if the peacekeeping forces come in, they have to be under American control, and obviously it doesn't work that way. So these are very, very serious questions of strategy, even among folks who are all on the same side fighting terrorism. So
yeah, and the other thing, I mean, I mentioned this Russia issue earlier, but actually I wonder, I mean, who's really winning in Afghanistan, if we can call this a victory already? Is it the Russians really, or is it the Americans, or is it Kharzi or whoever, or Dostum for that matter? But the thing is that the United States, Charu, in your opinion, is it amenable to follow some other option than the military one in terms of social kind of construction, reconstruction, economic, etc.? To what extent would it be willing to do so?
Well, I think Dean Allegato pointed out fairly accurately that not only is this akin to sowing the dragon's teeth, but a lot of movements that are now entering the rubric of quote-unquote Islamic terrorism are movements who have older roots, and many of the roots are socio-economic. At one point, we would often call them peasant revolts to remind ourselves that they involved, among other issues, questions of land reform, for example, or nationalist movements, questions of the formation, arbitrary formation of states and state territories in colonial times. And I don't think the U.S. is any more amenable today than it was when these movements emerged under a different rubric to handle the underlying problem. And I think that is partly because there's a serious failure to understand more recently there's some acknowledgement of precisely the levels of socioeconomic crises globally, especially in the past 20 years. But I think there's enormous amount of inertia in comprehending the fairly deep connection between the two. So I at least don't see signs that even when people argue that we should be humanitarian, we should be anti-poverty, and so on, that they're making in their actual policies the necessary connections between the fairly strong guerrilla and other movements and the actual socio-economic policies, questions of control over the IMF and the World Bank, questions of US foreign policy and economic policy, questions of national policy, it's not just US, but kind of local governmental structures, and how they fuel these movements. I think that connection is not adequately made enough to suggest a change in direction.
And not only we hear, for instance, that the Americans are in the Philippines and they want to intensify things in the Philippines via proxy forces, of course, with advisors, American advisors. But we also hear very well about Iraq, for instance. And we have, in fact, a tape, an interview on Iraq, Elton Daniel talking about it. So we'll watch that and then we'll discuss other stuff.
How a war on terrorism gets transmuted into a war on a nation state for reasons that really don't have anything to do with the agenda that we started out with is very difficult. And one country after another has made it very clear that they are not going to support any kind of adventure like that. Even the British are saying unless there's clear evidence that Iraq was somehow involved in a terrorist attack on the United States, there's no basis for leading a military operation against it, and they won't participate in it. We would essentially have to be going alone, I think, into a war like that. Or not quite alone, probably us and the Israelis would be going into a war. It's looking more and more like the side that wants to have another war has prevailed. And they are partly using this argument. We had such an easy time of it in Afghanistan. We really don't need to depend on anybody else. We don't care what the rest of the world thinks. These editorials, for example, by Krauthammer and Cohen in the Washington Post, the argument, it sounds almost unbelievable when you hear it. But their argument was essentially, we don't need to worry about what the man in the street thinks in any Arab or Muslim country. We don't care if they're our friends or not. All we want is for them to fear us. We can act alone, we can do whatever we want in any of these countries. They will accept what the United States tells them to accept, or they'll be obliterated. That's their philosophy, as simple as it can be.
So it's the Philippines, it's Iraq. So Krishna, any comments on Elton's and on U.S. policy in that way?
Well, I think as a characterization of American arrogance, at least significant portions of this administration's arrogance, I think Elton was right on. But to think that you can go in and make these societies fear you permanently, we saw the folly of such assumptions on September 11th itself. There is no society in this world that's going to take that sort of thing lying down. It never was the case in the past. I don't think it's there now. I think he's also right that there is an extraordinarily short-sighted approach by the current American administration on this whole matter. What is called, without any historical or other sorts of analysis, what is called terrorism is, first of all, as both Elton as well as Dina Legado and others have pointed out, have very diverse roots. They usually have to do with socioeconomic deprivations, there are social movements. In a previous era, all of those factors were abstracted out and we called it communism. Mm-hmm. In the present, it seems to be communism is replaced by terrorism. But in both cases, there is a similar disinclination to get at the reasons for the emergence of such movements and the reasons why inevitably they wind up on a collision course with US interests in those areas. What groups are being called terrorists today are actually instruments of every country's foreign policy. The Taliban emerged because of the support given to such schools by allies of the United States. Mm-hmm. It also emerged in part from the aftermath of the Soviet-Afghan War, in which case the resistance movements were supported extensively by the United States. The Mujahideen are a tool in Pakistan's foreign policy towards India. India has supported groups in Afghanistan, especially in the frontier regions, to destabilize the Northwest Frontier province in Pakistan. So to turn around and the state system suddenly say terrorism is bad, when everybody knows that terrorism is an important instrument in the foreign policy of so-called sovereign states, it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
Constructing a global coalition against terrorism is not a conceivable option.
Yeah. And the other thing, if you go against Iraq, you will be inviting actually that which you are fighting to come against you. Like, for instance, and who is to say after Iraq, maybe now we are friends with Iran because they're supporting us against the Taliban or in Afghanistan, etc. But who is to say later on, oh, Iran has the nuclear weapons, so let's wipe them out, etc. Conceivably, this could happen. What would you say?
Yeah, and I think, part of the reason we are talking about the situation as such is because it's not exactly clear what the strategy is as we move forward in terms of this war against terrorism. You talked about whether or not we can call what is happening in Afghanistan successful. I want to remind you that 10 years ago when United States attacked Iraq, that war was also called a successful war. And yet I think most people agree that at least partly we are paying for the implications of what went wrong in that war that were not clearly fleshed out during the immediate period. Now, in relationship to Saddam, I know there are elements within the administration who want some sort of bombing, and it's like some sort of, these are people who could not get Saddam last time for a variety of reasons. They made a decision and they want to complete the task this time. However, there are other ways of thinking about Iraq at this point, and people are doing it. Assistant Secretary of State Randy Crocker is in northern Iraq talking to the opposition, the Kurdish liberated area. The Iraqi National Congress, United States, is talking with the opposition. So the Iraqi option is not necessarily a bombing option, because I think Americans have learned that Saddam Hussein cannot be bombed out. I think we have bombed Iraq fairly often in the past 10 years or so, and continue to do so. So the question of how to get rid of Saddam Hussein is a complicated question that I don't think the administration has worked out very clearly, despite all the desires to do so. And I would say desire on the part of many people in the region for Saddam to go. But I don't think it's exactly clear, and that's part of the problem of these kind of loose talks that are being bandied about in relationship.
On that, the coalition against Saddam, is already suspect in the eyes of the Iraqi people and doesn't have much popularity. So there is a problem right there in terms, because it's how democratic that Congress is. That's very important. The other thing is that Now the Americans are talking about going to Somalia first, perhaps on their way to Iraq, like taking the detour, and so on. So it's rather interesting what you're saying regarding the question of strategy. What is the strategy? Another thing I think which is important, and we're going to watch a videotape in just a bit about it, is that one of the things that the Americans were saying, we have to solve the Palestinian question and give the Palestinians a state, yeah? And so at least Powell was talking about that. And all of a sudden, things changed, and now they are, the American administration is with Israel against the Palestinians and the Arabs. So that's another place maybe the Americans want to go and fight war by proxy or not so much by proxy. So we have a tape of Elton Daniel, whom I interviewed regarding this issue.
One of my criticisms of this concept of a war on terrorism from the very beginning was that potentially its most dangerous aspect is that other countries are going to want to use it as a model for dealing with their problems in one way or another. India and Kashmir is one possibility, and of course Israel and the Palestinians is the other. And in the early days of the conflict in Afghanistan, when it was really necessary for the United States to try to keep a lid on what the man in the street was thinking in Muslim countries, of course, it put a lot of pressure on the Sharon government not to react to any kind of provocation or attack, to take a restrained approach. Now that that restraint is gone, the United States really does not feel that it needs to maintain that relationship with Muslim countries anymore. And all of a sudden, the talk from Sharon is we're going to have our war on terror that's going to be a mini model of exactly the war that you're fighting, which is going after everyone even remotely associated with the phenomena in the most violent way that we deem necessary. And this time, of course, Washington has essentially said Israel is a sovereign nation. It has a right to defend itself, and it seems to be, do what you want. You're not going to get any criticism from us about it. It looks very, very bad. I think the suspicion has to be that Sharon has decided he's going to destroy the Palestinian Authority. He's going to destroy Yasser Arafat. He's going to try to impose some kind of settlement by force on the Palestinians and the Arabs. And that, again, to me, is likely to be a recipe for a disaster.
It seems to me that's exactly what opposite of what the Americans should be doing in Palestine and for the Palestinians, rather than allowing Sharon to destroy the Palestinians and the authority, or put the screws on them so much that they have to solve the Palestinian question in a fair and balanced manner. So, any comments, Charu, on that?
Yes. First, I think that this very directly indicates that in general the effort or approach has been to use the idea of diplomacy or of promising to address issues mainly when some kind of containment is needed. But there's a limit to how often you can do that because people stop trusting you. Mm-hmm. And the assumption, I think, as Krishna pointed out, that you can just resolve these issues by just going in and having a military solution, whether it be in Iraq, whether you take a detour through Somalia, it hasn't worked in the past in terms of resolving crises. So the question of who won in Afghanistan, the question is, long term, probably nobody, because the problem wouldn't disappear unless there's reconstruction. I think that especially in the Palestinian case, the idea that you can have any kind of long-term solution in the Middle East without handling that issue is I think...
it's sheer folly.
Sheer folly.
Before we go to another section of the program, we have questions from viewers. Marianne from Oahu, she asked, is America and Afghanistan to get access to oil? So we kind of talked a little bit about that, but is there anything else that we can say about that? I mean, how dependent is the United States on oil from that region, or those regions, actually?
From Central Asia?
And Central Asia.
Not much. It could become, I mean, there is no doubt that Saudi oil can be replaced by Russian oil or oil coming from Central Asia. But I think it's important for people to understand that the Taliban government was actually quite tolerated in the world until the September 11 fiasco. That is to say, the world was learning to live with the Taliban. The neighbors were, as well as the United States. The United States was one of the countries that was ready immediately to recognize Afghanistan. Had there not been feminist outcries, it would have probably recognized. So I don't necessarily think, as I said before, that the link is direct at this point, although there are no doubt that there are interests in the United States, particular interests, particular oil companies who have interest. I don't think it motivates this particular military campaign.
Yeah. Krishna, anything on that?
Well, actually, I think the explanation is fairly straightforward as to why the United States is in Afghanistan. I think explanations like oil are a little too convoluted and indirect. The fact is that September 11th happened, and it was more or less credibly traced to the Al-Qaeda network and people like Osama bin Laden, and there was also some evidence that they were, secreted, hidden, operating out of Afghanistan, and that's why the United States is in Afghanistan today. Some of these rationalizations, as Charu pointed out earlier, may be relevant in some much larger time frame, but I think the immediate reasons why the United States is in Afghanistan now are fairly short-term and clear-cut. It's because of, where the Al-Qaeda net. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. In typical American fashion now, Osama bin Laden is called UBL acronym.
That's
I
right.
thought it was called Benny.
Oh, Benny is another one, yeah. But it's interesting. Another viewer, Frank from Oahu also. Have you or anyone seen the movie Siege? What are your comments on that? Anybody saw Siege? I remember I remember that movie. It's in Latin America.
No, that was State of Siege.
Maybe Siege is another one?
Siege is another one about rounding up something happening in New York City, rounding up the Arab and Muslim population. But I've only read the reviews, so I cannot make comments.
Well, we're sorry, none of us seem to have seen this movie.
But hey, there are 5,000 Middle Easterners who are practically under siege right now, or will be very soon. And actually, that's not far-fetched. And this is a very important and disconcerting issue here. And in fact, this leads us to the next question. I mean, the part of the program today, because the thing is that we all talking about Afghanistan Patriot Acts, and the reason the program is named this way because Ashcroft has his own understanding of what patriotism is, and anybody who doesn't have this understanding of his is automatically unpatriotic, traitor, or whatever, giving aid to the enemy in direct or not in direct ways, etc. So, in fact, we all, especially with the question of the historic memory of the Japanese internment and so on, and it's a blot on American history, recent American history, etc. We don't want and we should not repeat it. So people who criticize those kinds of things, like what Ashcroft is talking about, or the Patriot Act, in fact, that passed Congress, or the question of civil liberties, etc., need to be, in fact, congratulated. And in fact, in one thing I wanted to show, the Advertiser on Monday this month, the 10th of this month, the editorial, Ashcroft's dismaying terrorism testimony, when he was testifying to Congress and really attacking anybody and everybody who was against his brand of patriotism, in fact. And this is actually a good segue to look at the question of civil liberties in this country, given those kinds of issues that we have overseas and here in this country. So we have a tape that would be good to see at this point, and the tape is ready.
If we look at Ashcroft and the complete elimination of fundamental liberties, it's mind-blowing, actually, that Americans who have prided themselves for so long of being the land of the free and the home of the brave have turned into total cowards and willing to give up all sorts of what they have said to be fundamental rights in order to be protected against whom, from what? We don't know. It's far too easy to draw a very negative future scenario for the United States, moving very in a very unified way with God on our side towards a very frightening form of fascism.
Yeah, I thought the political Islamists say God is on their side, so I don't know what the story here. Maybe there are mixed signals. But anyway, so Krishna, anything on that? These are kind of strong words by Jim Dator. But
well, actually, the fact that they sound strong is what's worrying me. Because if you look at what has happened since September 11th, what the amount of power conceded to the executive branch in the United States after the attacks on New York, if you look at what has, skated past the American public in terms of rights to hold people of Middle Eastern descent without trial, every university has been asked to furnish data about its foreign students. With one or two exceptions, most of them have just gone ahead and done so. The degree of public support, according to the usual Gallup polls, CNN polls, and all the rest of it, the degree of support for racial profiling is very high in the United States. I mean, it depends on how the question is phrased. But nevertheless, the assault on civil liberties has been quite breathtaking in its magnitude, and the degree of opposition to it has been, as Jim described, cowardly. And that, to me, is one of the most worrying things. We know that every episode in which the United States governments have turned on the civil liberties of certain segments of its people has historically been proven, with hindsight, to have been a disaster, to have been wrong-headed, and they have the verdict, as far as historians, as far as any commentators in the later periods are concerned, has been fairly unanimous. This is true of the Japanese internment. This is true of the McCarthy era. This is true of what was done to the socialists and communists during the interwar period. In each and every instance, that sort of witch hunt has proven on later to have been unnecessary, exaggerated, and really, in fact, besmirched the traditions of American democracy in a total way. And I think this time it's no exception. We are sort of reacting in a knee-jerk way with extreme hysteria. And the silence, in terms of opposition to it, outside of the universities and a few other places, there really isn't much sustained, the ACLU and some other places, there isn't much sustained opposition to what this government is doing. I mean, one member of Congress, remember, voted against this, and her words actually have received such little publicity. She should be a heroine, but hardly anybody knows her name.
She was ostracized too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Charu, any comments on this?
Yes, I mean, firstly, the deep irony of claiming that we are in here and going into Afghanistan to support the upholdment of rights for ordinary Afghani citizens and, ordinary Afghani women, and then turning around and interning their brothers and their fathers it's not lost on anybody in these regions. And I think, to follow up on that, in general, what is beyond the kind of official violations, what's really chilling and is bad for everybody, not just for Arab Americans, has been the culture of fear that makes us be afraid to speak our minds because we may be branded unpatriotic. And I think the consequences of this are not just felt by Arab Americans, they are felt by every single group that wishes to have some kind of say, some kind of criticism, and which feels afraid. So I think that culture is something we've seen in the past, and the recovery from that has been fairly painful for everyone. So I think it's not good at all.
Being critical of American policies in Afghanistan is indeed, a patriotic act in my mind. Sure. And it's not only the Ashcrofts who are the patriots in this instance. It is incumbent upon us. And in fact, the advertiser talks about Ashcroft should be in the business of defending dissent and dissenters, and not be trying to get rid of them. You see. But anyway, there goes Ashcroft for you. But Farideh.
I think it's also important to keep in mind the chilling effect this has on the immigrant communities in the United States, because the Patriotic Act, whatever it's called, makes a clear distinction between citizens and residents of the United States, and which is a very important distinction. It clearly identifies about 20 million people in the United States who are not yet citizens of the United States, and essentially strips them of all their rights that are given to citizens in the United States. And it's a very interesting sort of reflection on what happened to the Japanese in the United States, because what you hear about the Japanese internment now is sort of a revisionist history, that what was wrong during that period was that internment was done to full-fledged American citizens, and that's why it was wrong, not the whole notion that some people were brought and dealt with in an unfair manner. So I think it's very important to think of it in those terms as well.
Yeah, we have another interview with Elton Daniel on the question of the Patriot Act, so the tape is ready.
The Patriot Act had really given people pause, and as with many of these policies, the difficulty is when they're first proclaimed, they're always projected as somehow being very limited and moderate in their scope. And if it were simply a question of, for example, having military tribunals for a leader in bin Laden's organization who happens to be caught in Afghanistan, well, that's difficult to argue with. I mean, it is a conflict. These things have happened, and as long as things are carried out according to the Universal Code of Military Justice, I mean, you can't really complain. The problem is, within all of those things, there is the potential to use it not in that way at all. In theory, what it is laying out is the case that, for example, if you have, let's say, an Arab living in Detroit who at some time has contributed to an Islamic charity that somebody says has in some way donated money that has gone to help a bin Laden cause, that person becomes a criminal suspect who could be brought before a secret tribunal and even executed on the grounds of supporting terrorism. Now, whether things would actually go that far or not, I don't know. The government says, trust us, it won't. But anytime I hear a government saying, trust us, is when my alarm bells start going off. They say, well, this only applies to non-citizens in the U.S. Well, we already, of course, now have this case of an American who was fighting with the Taliban. Is he going to be tried in a military tribunal even though he's an American citizen? I mean, these questions will come up, and how far the government will go, I don't know. But there are lots of people who are definitely worried that John Ashcroft and George Bush are not people that should be trusted to use moderation on those kinds of issues.
Yeah, here again, I mean, another view on the question of the Patriot Act and the military tribunals, and these are not only disturbing, but beyond that even, because we are told that this would happen only overseas, but who knows if it is gonna be, if people who are one of those 20 million who are non-citizens, do you want to take them to overseas, to take?
It's not, the law is not at all clear the way it's written.
Exactly.
That it does not say, the law is very, in fact, it says that, anybody that is seen as engaging in unpatriotic acts, very nebulously defined, can be tried by military courts. Exactly. But it's not at all clear what is being said is that, yes, trust us, we're going to maybe most of the people will be from outside. But the law itself is very, very broadly defined, and that is why is eliciting reactions not only from the civil libertarians from the left, but also civil libertarians from the right.
Yeah,
because
like William Safire, for instance.
Yes, exactly, because they are very, very broadly defined, and it's also creating all sorts of problems with other members of the coalition.
That's right.
Because obviously, if the European countries have control of somebody who is considered to be engaged in unpatriotic acts,
or executable,
they have laws in Europe that will not allow them to hand them over to either military courts or to be executed, because the European protocol prohibits that. They would not do so. They would not hand them over to third world countries, undemocratic third world countries, and they would not hand them over to United States. And it's creating all sorts of interesting scenarios. For example, in Afghanistan, what would happen if the peacekeeping forces got hold of an Al-Qaeda person?
Or Bin Laden.
Or Bin Laden. Should they hand him over in Afghanistan to United States? Because if they take him to England, they cannot, technically, according to their own rules. So it's creating all sorts of ridiculous scenarios that I don't think need to be there. The circumstances do not call for it, and obviously it's an overreaction by a government that I don't think knows exactly what they are up to, and that is why Mr. Ashcroft is going to Europe in the next in the coming week to try to
browbeat them, or
well, it's not possible to browbeat them because the rules, the laws, the European protocols are very clear. Perhaps explain why they are overreacting and talk about ways to get around it. I'm not sure how.
Charu, anything on that you would like to bring up?
I think Farideh said it very well.
Another thing I think it's important is that for us to try and end on a positive note, optimistic note, etc. And then we have an interview with Jim Dator, who ends on a positive note. So let's go.
Once these events are behind us, once Americans have had a chance to think about what's happened to them, I believe that there will be a reflection on energy, on oil. I think that's one of the major outcomes of this. We will be thinking about new energy systems. We will begin to think about self-sufficiency in ways that we have not thought about it before. We will rethink our role in globalization. The whole globalization project is being rethought. I think that also, and we've already seen this, Islam will rise tremendously in people's consciousness in a positive sense. There already have been a very large number of conversions in the United States to Islam, recognizing that this must be an extremely powerful religion if people are willing to act as the way people allegedly have. So I think that the evolution of America as an ordinary nation in a community of other nations might very well be a positive outcome over the next 20 or 30 years. It's too bad that it took something so horrendous to make Americans be able to reflect upon their position in the world, but that might be the outcome of this.
So, Charu, anything on what Jim said?
If such positive outcomes were to come about, that would be at least one ray of hope in a fairly painful, difficult situation. But I think Jim is a little optimistic. Already in the discussion of the Patriot Acts, we've seen that not only is there not much consideration of the issue of military tribunals and diplomacy or other mechanisms to handle issues, but there is a fairly sharp distinction being drawn between the concept of rights of Americans versus rights of others, which would apply not only within this country's borders but internationally. And that, I think, is an indication that perhaps the type of changes Jim indicates might
Yeah.
not come
Well,
about.
thank you for
Yeah.
the discussion, and we thank our viewers for joining us, and see you next year. Happy New Year, good holiday seasons, seasons greetings. Thank you.